Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler. I have two distinguished guests with me today, Dennis Speed and Paul Gallagher. And Paul, why don't you introduce yourself? This is the first time that you've been on Issues That Matter.
Yes, fine. Thanks for inviting me. I'm the economics co-editor of Executive Intelligence Review. That's a weekly publication going back to 1974, continuously since then, associated with Lyndon LaRouche's movement. And I've also, in the past, had a great deal to do with the pro-nuclear policy, both fission and fusion of that movement. And I served as the executive director of the Fusion Energy Foundation, which was quite prominent and very large publisher, popular science publisher back in the about 30 or 40 years ago. So what I'd like to talk about today, if I may, is a new element in the war crisis, which is the imminent serious financial crisis, which has started in the British financial system. So I'll just say that.
Okay,
Right.
Dennis, why don't you reintroduce yourself? You've been on a few times, so let everybody know who you are.
Yeah, my name is Dennis Speed, and I've been uh, a writer. I've written for Executive Intelligence Review, for example, since about the 1980s. I wasn't just sort of as a freelance journalist. I've done a lot of work, of course, as you know, Cynthia, with your Diane Sayre and her independent campaign
Right.
in New York, and recently was in Europe, in Germany and France, where this about 3 weeks ago, where we got a good sort of firsthand look at the level of both destabilization and also social upheaval that's going on in the context of what people keep referring to as the Ukraine-Russia war.
Hmm.
That's that's who I am.
Wow. Okay, Paul, would you like to start the conversation?
Well, as I indicated, one thing your listeners should realize is going on is a serious crisis has hit the financial system in the UK, which this began roughly the 26th, 27th of September. And the efforts of the Bank of England and the government to bring it under control have failed up to now, right up to this morning, um, where again, this morning, the interest and yesterday, the interest rates on British government securities are shooting up. To give you an idea, 2/3 of a percentage point in one day yesterday was the increase in the interest rates on what they call there the gilts, the government bonds. Um, so this is now going on a 2.5, 3 week uh, crisis, which has very strong indications and potential for contagion to spread into other financial, national financial systems, potentially to spread even globally. Uh, and importantly, it was caused directly by the war policy of the British government. So I'll just say that much to begin with, um, not to get into more complicated aspects of it, but this is something which could turn into a worse global financial crisis and crash than in 2008. Um, Not necessarily tomorrow, but it is heading in that direction. And it comes directly from the NATO policy of war, of which the British government has been consistently the most extreme actor and exponent. So I'll say that much to begin with.
Let me interject this thought. The markets don't seem to be doing well, and I told my broker about 3 or 4 weeks ago, get me out. And I have a friend who has money in the market, and I said, Anne, you better get out. She said, oh, I'll ride this out. It'll go down and then it'll come back. What do you think, Paul?
People pay because the media pays a tremendous amount of attention to the stock markets, what they call the equity markets. And people watch their investments in those markets much more closely than they do what are usually their larger investments, if they have any, in the credit markets, in the bond markets, in the mortgage markets, and so forth. Those markets are significantly larger. They have much more to do with people's lives than the stock markets do, and yet everyone watches the stock market. So the crisis that's hit in the UK and is spreading out of the UK financial system is in the credit market, in the market initially of of British government bonds, and in the markets for lending by the banks to the pension funds in the UK, with the pension funds at this point being propped up. They were at the brink of failure. In fact, the Bank of England, in a letter to the Parliament, to a parliamentary committee on the 5th of this month, said as much, that most of the large pension funds in the UK were hours from failure in the overnight period, 27th and 28th of September, when the Bank of England had to rush in with quantitative easing, bond purchases, which it is still doing, and it is still expanding them 2.5 weeks later with no end in sight. So that's what makes serious financial crises. And of course, when they occur, and when deep recessions occur, the stock markets also go way down. So
When you say pension fund, what uh, what segment of the population are you talking about? Government workers?
uh, government workers and private sector workers. These are more than 20 large pension funds in the UK, administered through usually the City of London banks, but also BlackRock Inc., the biggest financial firm in the world on Wall Street. That's a major manager and lender into these pension funds. I won't try to explain this quickly, but they got into extraordinarily leveraged, that is borrowed, using debt to create assets when there were not assets there, using derivatives to create assets which did not exist on the books of these pension funds. They got into extraordinary hanky-panky financial derivatives exploitation, and it went wrong on them when the British government made certain announcements on the 26th, 25th, and then 26th of September. It went completely wrong. And again, as the Bank of England said to the Parliament, those funds were going to wind up, meaning liquidate, on September 28th, if the Bank of England had not worked all night to come up with a bailout money printing spree, both to save those pension funds and also to try to induce the banks which had been lending to them to resume their lending, which so far has not worked. So there you have it. And then the kind of derivatives that they were all using to fake their assets are called interest rate swaps. People know that the volume of derivatives in the world is immense. It's on the order of perhaps 800 trillion in claimed value, nominal value. But 500 trillion of that, at least, is in interest rate swaps. So 13 years ago in the crash, people got to know something called credit default swaps, which played a major role in triggering that whole global crash. But credit default swaps were 65 trillion in nominal value. Interest rate swaps are at least 500 trillion in nominal value. And they are the ones that are spreading the contagion of this London financial crisis right now to the rest of the world. So again, it sprung directly from the government of Liz Truss, the new prime minister, trying to bail out energy companies because of the sanctions and the war policy, which the British initiated. And she announced as soon as she came in that the government would borrow, and get this, somewhere between, she didn't give a figure, but they leaked it, somewhere between 200 billion pounds and 400 billion pounds. That is between about 250 and 500 billion dollars equivalent. The government would borrow that in order to bail out energy companies, which could not pay the tremendously increased even wholesale prices for energy as a result of the war and the sanctions. As soon as she made that announcement, chaos hit the British credit markets, and it hasn't stopped since then, and it's spreading out of that financial sector into others in the world.
Dennis?
Yeah, I have something I'd like to bring up here and actually ask Paul about it, because since he just was talking particularly about the Liz Truss episode, here's something that might be, I think will be of great interest to the audience. And I have a question that I'd like Paul to clarify. We know that in the last roughly 3-4 days, the Biden administration got deeply distressed when, instead of getting 1 million more barrels per day from Saudi Arabia, which is what they had basically been negotiating with them, at least they thought, the Saudis announced that they were going to cut production of oil by 2 million barrels a day. Now, there are many things that might be said about this. The Saudis said they had never promised that. They were talking about increasing capacity, which is completely different than production. But leave that as it may. The reason I'm bringing it up is that what gets talked about often is this issue of oil production and supply and demand, and then the prices changing and so on. Now, the reason I'm asking about it is because there's a completely different facility which is in Amsterdam, London, which is called the Title Transfer Facility Market. Now, what this basically is, it's a speculative market in which you've got, all sorts of trades of oil. What they do is they sort of average out the price of all of the trades. So this has nothing to do with physical production. This has to do with trading back and forth between different people holding titles to barrels of oil or for that matter, futures in oil. Here's the thing that I'd like Paul, if you could, to give people a sense of the difference between talking about what the Saudis are doing. And of course, one of the reasons that the Saudis said they did it, they're part of OPEC after all, and the Russians are part of OPEC plus. Their job is to regulate the price of oil, except they were getting from both Liz Truss and from Joe Biden in a different way this idea about capping the price of oil, and they're supposed to sort of just do that at the behest of the British government and the American government. Well, what happened was basically they refused. Biden has been shocked because he doesn't have the necessary reserves in the United States. He's dipping back into the National Reserve, but he's getting into trouble. But that's not the same thing at all as the actual setting of the price by the speculative markets. So, Paul, you said before that Truss got into trouble because when she came in, she wanted to bail out the so-called energy merchants. So if you could just sort of give people an idea about the difference between the shock as a result of what she did and the shock or the idea of supply and demand, which I don't think is actually the primary thing acting here.
Well, that's true. It's not. The physical economy rules in this case, and the speculators, which do tremendous damage through such things as that title transfer facility, spot markets, they nonetheless are speculating on changes in the underlying physical economy. If those changes were not occurring, those speculations would not have the same effect. Now, what the crisis in the financial markets that I'm discussing originated directly from the war policy of the British government, or of NATO as a whole, led by the British. crisis now that seems to have been put upon the Biden administration by this OPEC announcement stems directly from the Green New Deal. I can give you two figures. In 2015, the total amount of investment in oil and natural gas, what they call the liquid fuels, or the liquid fossil fuels, that total investment in 2015, which includes discovering new fields as well as recovering the oil and refining it and so on, was on the order of $800 billion per year. By 2019, it was down to $350 billion per year. It's now below $250 billion per year. Disinvestment, that's what it's called, in the entire oil, in the entire fossil fuel sector. What I'm talking about is investment in two of the fuels there, oil and natural gas. Same thing has happened with coal. Disinvestment. So when OPEC Plus, as they call it, made this announcement, they were talking about lowering their quotas for production, when actually the United States has been hoping they would raise their quotas by 1 million barrels a day. Instead, they lowered them by $2 million a day. That's not the same as lowering their production, because their production had already been far below their quotas because of this disinvestment. And at times during the past 2 years, OPEC production has been as much as 3 million barrels a day lower than the total of the quotas of the participating countries. Why? Because they've lost their capacity, or they're losing their capacity through this disinvestment. So what the Saudis was announcing was a bit of was true, but the coverage of it internationally has been a complete fake. They were not announcing a cut in production. They were announcing a cut in quotas, which were already not being met by most of the countries involved in OPEC Plus for that reason. Then if you look at the United States side of it, the United States, of course, is an oil exporter. Any idea that it needs Nigerian oil, or that it needs needed Russian oil of 100,000 barrels a day, is nonsense. The United States is an oil exporter, but it has declining, decrepit, disappearing refinery capacity. Right? Just a few years ago, we had the second largest refinery complex in the United States near Philadelphia, essentially blew up and was on fire for days and then was shut down. That's gone. We haven't had a new refinery added in the United States for nearly 40 years. So we're becoming like Nigeria has always been notorious for, a producer of a great deal of oil, which can't refine it, doesn't have the capacity, and therefore is in crisis as to gasoline, diesel fuel, heating fuel, and so forth, those things which have to be refined. So now, they're considering all sorts of things. Taking another 10 million barrels out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is one thing that they have floated. They've already got it down to something like a 25-year low in what's in that reserve. But again, you've got to refine it. So that's not where the problem really is. More likely, what they'll do is they'll ban gasoline exports from the United States, which largely go to countries in South America, which need them. So you will see, if they go that route, then you will see those countries suffering in order to try to keep the price of gasoline where it is in the United States until the election. At the same time, they're going to Venezuela again, talking about maybe making a deal to allow Venezuela oil to be brought in, including Venezuelan refined products, to be brought into the United States. So if Venezuela goes along with that, they are suckers, because shortly after the election, the sanctions will be put back on, right? So there's more fakery in terms of what people hear about the sector of oil than just about any other sector in the entire world economy, even including Wall Street and finance.
Mhm.
Virtually nothing is what it really appears to be. But
What,
yeah,
the three of us live in the United States, and we're talking about the hardships in England. In the United States, the price of home heating oil and the price of gasoline for their cars. What do you envision for this winter?
well, the price of home heating oil is definitely going to be very high, very high. Uh, a lot of home heating oil has been replaced in recent years by other forms of heating. The price of natural gas is also going to go up sharply, I think, this winter in the United States, but nothing like the United States has done in Europe, where we have taken our liquefied natural gas exports, diverted them all from Asia and sent them all to Europe. Uh, and as the Europeans are shouting at this point, some of them, that liquefied natural gas is 4 times the price wholesale now, 4 times the price they're paying that they were paying for natural gas coming from Russia. So essentially, it's the kind of a vice, an economic vice, which is being placed upon European countries, and they are just beginning to moan and complain, and some of them actually scream a little bit at this point. What about people in the United States? There's so few, especially among elected officials so far, 2 or 3 or 4, who have said we should stop pumping all these weapons and money into this war because this is turning into an economic engine of destruction. And it's not just in Europe, it's coming at us.
Dennis?
Yeah, I have that leads to another question. Some commentators, as of yesterday, were bringing up, this was on the Duran and some of these other platforms, that the United States could also cut any sales of liquefied natural gas that they were planning for Europe. Now, I don't know how far that's even gone. I don't know if you've heard anything about that, Paul, but were, first of all, given what's happened with the Nord Stream pipeline, I'd like you to discuss just what impact that has one way or the other. But the second question I have related is if there were, because the European situation is quite dire, how would that affect the NATO alliance? Because you're talking about the issue of the war being stopped. Obviously, there's a social factor already. There are demonstrations going on. There's other kinds of dissent being expressed by people in Hungary and some other the leadership there and some other countries. So if you could just discuss your view of that.
Paul?
Well, it's starting to fracture the European Union in terms of its cohesion as well as its view of the United States. There was not much natural gas left coming through the Nord Stream pipelines into Europe in any case when the sabotage occurred. But this had a very terrifying effect in terms of Germany, because it was essentially saying the end, forget it, there will be no, that pipeline is not there anymore, and it will not be there. And, this winter we will burn trash in order to keep our homes heated, as in Poland they already are. So now you have, not just in Britain, but also in Germany, 200 billion euro program of bailing out households and businesses which can't buy their energy, can't afford the energy. $200 billion program in Germany, and immediately other countries in Europe cried out, well, Germany can do this without destroying its credit entirely the way Britain just did, but we can't. So this isn't fair because Germany has a good credit rating. It can borrow $200 billion. We can't do anything like that. So we will freeze while Germany bails people out. Now, yesterday, the Chancellor of Germany said, well, okay. I will change my position entirely and say that there can be euro bonds, special euro bonds floated in order to bail out companies and households on their energy bills. And those will be bonds for the eurozone as a whole, meaning essentially Germany will be the backer for the borrowing of every country in the EU in order to bail out energy prices. So this is already causing splits. And the foreign minister of the EU, so-called Joseph Borrell, he just made a statement, I think last night, that central banks all over Europe are being forced to follow the Federal Reserve to defend their currencies when their economies are already in deep recession. So again, how long should we wait until ours, which is only now in technical recession, until ours goes into deep recession? How long should we wait while the developing countries are in depression, absolute depression, famine is spreading? How long should we wait before we adopt the opposite policy, a policy of every effort to bring this war to an end? Even the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman under Obama, Mullins, said yesterday, we've got to bring this conflict to an end. We've got to bring about somehow negotiations, bring this to an end. How long before we do that and pursue a policy which is actually in the interests, to the benefit of all the countries in the world?
The military industrial complex seems to be doing okay. I don't see this ending tomorrow.
Can't disagree with you on either of those two.
Okay. Okay, Dennis?
Yeah, I think that what we've been covering in this program is really critical for people to understand, because the notion is that the war precipitated the financial crisis. Well, the war affected the financial crisis, but it did not, in fact, create it. We already had inflationary pressures that were very explicit in the field of energy prior to the war by about 5-6 months, and food prices, other prices, and so on. You had a kind of a tendency toward hyperinflation quite a bit before. But what we've just been describing, especially this thing about the transition in government, coming back to this, in other words, with Liz Truss coming in, the death of the Queen of England, and then Truss trying to take these measures, which have been confusing to say the least to many people. I guess my question, Paul, and my question in general, I'll make an observation, then Paul, you have something probably to say about it, is I believe that what we're in America, go into America for a minute, is that a great pressure, let's an alternative, which we've had in America for a long time, Glass-Steagall, could be implemented. But of course, the problem involved is you can't do anything as long as this war is going on. And as you know, Cynthia, from having Diane on, and Scott Ritter as well, the idea that both of them put forward is that the Ukraine war is really a war with NATO and Russia. It's a no-win war, and could escalate the thermonuclear conflict. Many people are talking about that too. But if the driver is there, if there's this impulse, which we're seeing from Liz Truss and others, because they have an impending collapse of the monetary system, that's actually a greater impulse to go forward with a devastating war. And so it seems to me, and this I guess I ask you about, Paul, what can we do to defuse that? Because if you can't defuse that, actually the war will definitely be perpetuated, it seems to me.
Well, I would say you have to go back. The Bretton Woods system was destroyed in 1971. We had then the floating exchange rate system, which was fostering speculation everywhere in all the countries of the transatlantic world and in Japan and so forth, fostering speculation instead of production and productivity. But for 20 years after that, the Soviet Union existed, and most of the time a Soviet-China alliance existed. And so there was a strong limit on how far speculation could destroy productivity in our economies, because we had all over the world competition with countries which seemed to be striving for productivity. As much as many faults as they had otherwise, they were striving for productivity. They were striving for production and influence with us. 1990, there was a tremendous change in the policy outlook of most of the oligarchy, the financial elites in the United States and in Europe. Now we have won. The Soviet Union is gone. We're completely victorious. We no longer have any competition. We can do whatever we want as far as free trade, speculation, deregulation of banking and everything else. We promptly got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act in the course of the 1990s. And there was complete banking deregulation, and there began to be financial crises and small crashes, basically at 2 or 3 year intervals as a result. Nothing on the scale of 2008, but that led into 2008. By 2008, Russia had made a revival since 99 when Putin came in. It had revived itself from the door of death, from the door of genocide, and was again becoming a factor. But since 2008, since that crash with the money pumping of the central banks being the driver of the economy, productivity and production went out the window. And instead, speculation ruled everywhere with zero interest rates. It was very easy. Productivity and production just went down and down and down. And beginning with the particularly 2010, 2011, at that point, Lyndon LaRouche looked at the overthrow and assassination of Gaddafi in Libya and the coming civil war then in Syria. And he said, what they're aiming at, the British, he said specifically, what they're aiming at is war with Russia. If they can get war with Russia and win it, then again, they're totally home free. They can inflate whatever debt they want. They can write off whatever debt they want. They can raise interest rates, lower them in any way that they want, and create austerity on a global scale, and nobody will bother them, Wall Street and London, because there will be no Russia, there will be no adversary to interfere. So in a sense, the war policy came from the financial crisis, not the other way around.
Let me interject this thought, and what you guys are saying is like really profound, but there's Napoleon, there's Hitler. They both met their demise when they invaded Russia. What makes the West think today that will not happen again?
I'll say something short on that and let Paul then take it from there. Back in the spring, the finance minister of France, Bruno de la Maire, I think is his name, talked about a financial nuclear war with Russia, saying that what was going to happen is, well, now the Russians have really stepped in it. They made a tremendous mistake, and we are going to basically collapse their economy. This is not just a war against Putin. This has got to be a war against the Russian people. He actually made those statements. Now that we are in October, let's put it this way. Apparently, the Russians won the financial nuclear war. And these people don't think about the idea that in some respects, some of the things that Putin is doing that they presume are military tactics are actually economic tactics. For example, his whole negotiation with Saudi Arabia around the question of the negotiations around some of the prisoners that were captured from Ukraine and exchanges with Russia. This was very criticized by people, and even including in Russia. But then what happened was, you have the Saudis making it very clear that they intend that the relationship with Russia, and the relationship for that matter with Asia, is primary to them, is as important, certainly, as the relationship to the United States. So you see that there are these moves that are being made continually around the issue of this war, but they are outside of the domain of comprehension of the people who are leading the countries in France and Britain, etc. They don't get it. They don't get the world they're in. And I think that that may be how we stumble into something as catastrophic as thermonuclear conflict. So I'll end it there. Paul will have a different view, I think.
No,
Wow.
I think is I completely agree with that. They can talk all they want about the week to week fortunes of the armies in the war in Ukraine, but the financial and economic, above all, the economic impact of the war on the United States and Europe has been far greater and worse than the impact of the sanctions and the war in Russia. And we haven't even discussed the position of China and the position of India in this, which are potentially countries that can, in the BRICS alignment, which can actually come up with new credit arrangements and monetary arrangements as well for a kind of a new Bretton Woods system for the world as a whole. So again, they had the intention. I guess you could say this was a Napoleonic intention. Cynthia, you asked at the beginning, what were they thinking? Well, what was Napoleon thinking when he charged all the way towards Moscow in the middle of the winter? What was
Hmm.
he thinking? That the Russians and the Germans who were helping them would think of nothing on their side, that they would have no comeback to this whatsoever. Um, this was a pretty Napoleonic charge as well. It was a charge saying, as Lemaire said, essentially already at the beginning, we've already won. So let's go for total destruction of the adversary in every way. And the outcome so far has been very, very, very different in terms of economies and in terms of financial and even currencies, where they keep saying the strongest currency in the world in the last 8 months has been the Russian ruble. Well, that's not really true because it's really circulating only within Russia. But it's beginning, they're beginning to make arrangements with quite a number of countries to use it in trade instead of the dollar. And despite that, it has not gone down. It's still considerably stronger than it was before this whole conflict began.
Dennis?
Well, I think that is exactly the illustration. I mean, what happens is there's a book I always keep on my desk by Barbara Tuchman, and it's called The March of Folly. And it was The March of Folly from Troy to Vietnam. And what she talks about is that there's a phenomenon in history that she's noted, which is that somehow, despite the fact that you can illustrate that countries are acting exactly against their self interests, what happens is leaderships go ahead and pursue that nonetheless. That's because people are committed to axioms, and the axioms get in the way of their thinking. And I think what has happened, by the way, there is a completely different approach that can be taken. There's some interesting matters that people like Elon Musk said, Donald Trump has said a few things, but of course, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Diane, has put forward a completely different idea, a new security and development architecture. There's no problem with the idea of economic development being the basis for peace. You can redevelop Ukraine as long as Ukraine is neutral, and you actually start from the standpoint of no military engagement. And then have negotiations based on that. So I believe that that's not only possible, I think it's also necessary. So that's what I would say.
Great. We've been talking now for about 45 minutes, and you guys have said a lot for people to digest. Let's have another conversation. This stuff is really great. Would you be interested, both of you?
I'm fine.
Okay.
Yes, certainly.
Terrific.
Great.
So, You've been listening to. I'm so sorry. Your your
Paul
name is,
Gallagher.
yes, Paul.
Yeah.
You've been listening to Paul Gallagher and Dennis Speed. I'm Cynthia Pooler. This is Issues That Matter. And if you like this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you guys. This has been enlightening. Have a great day. And thank you, everybody, for listening.